Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. In this interview, I had the privilege of chatting with Taylor Storey. In a nearly 3-hour interview, we covered quite a lot of ground, so I want to first of all point you to timestamps in the show notes for easy reference. But I also want to take a few minutes here to lay out what I think are some important concepts to listen out for throughout the episode. First, much of what we discuss is going to center around true prophets and false prophets, which, if you've listened to this season, is a really common theme. We are especially going to ask whether rotten fruit is an independent occurrence or a systemic one. Is there a worm in one apple, or is the whole tree bad? Now that's a question we grapple a lot with throughout the season, and one which you can find prominently in my interview with Drew Johnson, as well as the episode on eudaimonism. So go check out those episodes if this theme interests you. Another theme we get into is related to the ideal. Now, Taylor and I are going to argue that holding onto an ideal isn't idealistic, but rather it's what drives us to true, right action. To throw off the ideal and compromise is what tends to lead to injustices and great evils. While embracing consequentialism might seem to produce better results, better fruit in the short term, it actually creates destruction and rotten fruit in the long run. Finally, we touch on quite a lot of historical events. We get into Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Moody, Reagan, Machen, Nicaragua, and the Contras, and a lot more. Many of these topics are discussed throughout the season in episodes like our one on Haiti or on media conspiracies with Gary Webb. While our focus in this episode was mostly on Christianity and Christendom, because we live in the West, that means that our history is saturated with Christian influence. If you haven't listened to the rest of the season, I highly recommend you at least go back and search for some of the episodes this interview touches on. Okay, enough of me talking now, because you're about to enter a pretty hefty episode, and one which I hope you'll enjoy. So here it is. My interview with Taylor Storey. I think you were actually the first person that I interviewed for the podcast a while back, and it was pretty messy. It didn't go too well because I had to splice some things and everything. But hopefully, I'm a lot better at this thing now, and things will go well. But I wanted to ask you here today because you have a lot of expertise and you've delved a lot into existentialism and evangelicalism. And so I want to kind of ask you a bunch of questions and let you talk about that. But before you do, I kind of want to set the stage a little bit with something that I think is interesting. It's actually, I was reading this guy. I don't know if you've heard of him, and I'm going to say his name wrong because it's French, but Gustave Le Bon. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, don't know him.
Okay, he wrote a book. His famous book is called The Crowd, but he also wrote one on the psychology of revolution. And it was really interesting because when he was talking about the Reformation, he mentioned something that I think is going to be pertinent tonight. He talked about how, from his perspective, and he's a post-revolutionary Catholic guy, I think, or atheist writing in France. But he said, look, the Reformation is just part of this crowd psychology. And essentially what they did is, okay, you had a bunch of people who maybe really were convicted, like Luther, about certain ideas. But what you ended up having is it gained a lot of momentum because you had people like princes who co-opted this movement because they were self-interested parties. And what the princes got from it was they got power away from the church. They wrested power from the church. And then they were actually able to swoop in to the Catholic churches and take all that wealth that the Catholics had. And it was interesting because, I'd read some other works on Luther and Zwingli. And what was interesting to me was, they ended up persecuting these Anabaptists, these people from, they were called the radical reformers, who were like, hey, look, your Reformation isn't good. We need to go further because government is bad. And Luther and Zwingli, Zwingli was on board with that. He was basically like an Anabaptist. But when he saw the tides turning and the princes kind of getting involved, the princes saved Luther, and Zwingli's like, I better get out of this radical Reformation. And so he ended up actually swinging and killing the very people who he was once a part of. He was a pretty big jerk. He said, "I'm going to give him a third baptism," because the reformers, they baptized their infants, and you have the radical reformers who baptized as adults. And then he's like, "Okay, we're going to drown him. Like we'll execute him by drowning and give him a third baptism." So anyway, you have people like Zwingli and others who are basically turning to the state because it gives them power, it gives them safety. And so I'm part of a Reformed denomination. We use the Westminster Confession of Faith. Are you familiar at all with that?
Yeah, I actually did the Westminster Catechism way back in the day.
Okay. Yeah. Our church is, that's a pretty revered document. What was really interesting to me was when I discovered that, well, we actually don't have the original Westminster Confession, but there were some amendments made, and there weren't all that many made, but there were some pretty big ones. All right, one of them was on the civil magistrate in section 23, and on the civil magistrate, they used to say, "Hey, the civil magistrate needs to protect the church, the peace and purity of the church, and they can call synods and all that kind of stuff." Well, guess what? They changed that. You know when they changed it? Do you have any guess at all?
No. I looked over the notes, but
well, I just added this. Yeah. They changed that section in 1789 in the United States, in America, right? So they took that out and they said, no, the king can't do that. No longer should they persecute people who don't believe, right? So the original Westminster is like, no, they have this power, and then is this very serious document that you don't change much at all. But then in 1789, right, God moved, and they changed it to align with whatever the government of their day was. And so there are a number of these other examples. But I thought, Laverne pointing out the Reformation and the changes in the Catechism are going to be a good backdrop for what I want to talk to you about today, because we're going to start by talking about Kierkegaard, who is somebody who recognized how people of his day in the 1800s, like, halfway from the Reformation to now, how they were kind of in bed with the state, and how you have this stream of Christianity that is just continuing to capitulate to the state. So I want to talk about that today. Before we do, if you just want to give yourself an introduction, that would be awesome.
So I was homeschooled K through 12, went to Cedarville University. That's how I know you. I did my first 2 years there, and then worked at some like Calvary Chapel churches, also a Presbyterian church. Went to seminary for a little bit at Western Seminary, and dropped out, then went to Jerusalem and studied kind of like a more historical approach to the Bible. Just did one semester, but it really changed my life. And then did a bunch of international things. I taught in China for a year, and worked in humanitarian aid, and then fell into installing solar and wanted to go back to school. So I went back to school in Germany, in Potsdam, which is like right outside Berlin. I took classes at Humboldt zu Berlin. And one night I was having beers, and I walked outside the bar and I saw a plaque that said, "This is where Soren Kierkegaard lived." And I was like, "What? Soren Kierkegaard lived here?" And then I did a bunch of research and found out that he spent about the same amount of time, 3 years, studying in Berlin, I think on 2 different occasions. And then I think I had a similar process with Christianity, that I was raised in the fundamentalist side of things and was a little bit disillusioned with that, especially as a result of studying historical Bible stuff, what's called historical criticism in the academic fields, but is what I kind of studied in Jerusalem. And And I just didn't see it kind of lining up. I didn't see it being good news. And so I thought I was going to distance myself, but actually Kierkegaard kind of brought me back. A lot of things brought me back when I was in Berlin, but Kierkegaard's training in Christianity might be the single thing that helped me the most. Another friendship with a friend that we talked a lot about a lot of things, but yeah. So yeah, now I finished the master's. It took me a long time. And I wrote about, I guess what we're going to talk about today, which is, titled the thesis, I think, History of Colonizing Christianities, which is kind of this in bed with the state thing. And then I focused on the origins and effects of the Dwight Moody, Cyrus McCormick Jr. gospel, what I called it, because there's a whole bunch of background that we'll probably get into today. That happened shortly after Kierkegaard kind of named this problem with Christianity as it was in his day versus Christianity as he saw it practiced biblically, and I think historically as well.
All right, I will. I'll have to check out that one by Kierkegaard. I have to admit, the first one that I read from Kierkegaard didn't make me like him too much. It was the one I don't remember what it's called, Fear and Trembling, I think. And
Same for me.
I was like, this is just weird. And then I watched some videos on him and I was like, okay, well, the concept's really cool, but it seems like you have to kind of devote your life to understanding him because he uses all these pseudonyms. And I'm like, okay, I can just get the gist from these guys. But I did end up committing to read Attack Upon Christendom because that sounded really cool. So I read that and I enjoyed that. But you recommend Training in Christianity?
I think so, yeah. But I think Attack Upon Christendom is probably the best. Well, yeah, it's a shorter. It takes like all his thoughts. I think in the very beginning he has this thing where he's like talks about like a dog on a leash, right? And then he's like, okay, now I'm like letting the dog out, like. So he's like, I'm gonna actually blast Christianity for what I think is really going on. But it's kind of a rehash of something he wrote earlier, which is Training in Christianity. But I think I would go with Attack. If you had to choose one, and I would choose Attack Upon Christendom. Okay. But it was kind of Training in Christianity that like hammered home the difference for me. I can talk about that.
I guess what would be important here is because, I wouldn't have understood the distinction several years ago, but he is a Christian. He's not saying attack upon Christianity. He's saying attack upon Christendom. And I think that's an important distinction that not everybody might understand. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Kierkegaard and why he's important for Christianity, because he is a Christian, and attacking Christendom, I would say, is a very important job of being a true Christian.
Yeah. So in Attack Upon Christendom, that is kind of what he has this line, and I can't remember. I think it is Attack Upon Christendom where he says, "Oh, Luther, how terrible." Do you know this line? "You had 95 theses, but I have only one. My one thesis is that Christianity no longer exists." In the land of Christendom, he was going back in between Copenhagen and Denmark, mostly Copenhagen, but it was it was not a massive city at that time. He also lived at the same time Hans Christian Andersen, which is kind of interesting, but they didn't like each other. They knew each other, but they didn't like each other. Kierkegaard wasn't liked by very many people because he was kind of calling out the BS of the system, especially the Christian system. And he actually says in his journals, I can't remember exactly where, but he says in his journals that his most important work was Training in Christianity, which is funny. Like you mentioned Fear and Trembling, because I read that too. And I think that's almost like from a non-Christian perspective, they like that book more. But I think Kierkegaard was really dealing with problems of Christianity. That was his real thing. And I'd say Kierkegaard seems to be read more by non-Christians than by Christians. And so they don't like understand this Christianity versus Christendom thing or all this stuff that's going on. And so then they go to maybe the text that's easiest to understand from a non-Christian perspective, potentially. But I read Fear and Trembling and I was like, okay, leap of faith, like great. Like it didn't do very much for me. But Training in Christianity, I think it's the like very first chapter. He talks about the invitation of Jesus, come and follow me. And he says, when it's totally different who says, come and follow me. So in Denmark in his day, they had these big churches in the middle of every town, with ministers that were paid very well by the state, wearing robes and gold and all this stuff, saying, come and follow me, announcing, this is Jesus, come and follow. And he's like, that's easy. That's not crazy. It's not shocking. That's very easy to follow this wealthy thing. But he's like, but Jesus he never spoke from glory is the term that he used, at least translated in English. There's a few translations, by the way. The book is sometimes called Training in Christianity and sometimes called Practice in Christianity. I don't know which is better. I've kind of flipped through both. The one I read was called Training in Christianity. But he says, so when Jesus says that in the gospel, he's like a homeless ex-carpenter, washed up rabbi who says, come and follow me. And I was thinking about that. Okay, if I saw like somebody on the street who's saying, come and follow me, come be fishers of men, that's crazy. That is absurd. That's not the kind of person that we'd follow. And so I think that is like almost the foundation of Christendom, this wealthy, incredible church, robes, money, everything, versus someone who's saying, no, I came to bring good news to the poor. And so there's this distinction of Christianity of Jesus versus the Christendom of his day, and I would say our day, and probably, ever since Constantine, pretty much, or Theodosius, to be a little bit more historically correct. But yeah, so I think that's the distinction. And Kierkegaard also then is kind of considered the father of existentialism, which is not, at least in my understanding, it's not as inaccessible as I originally thought. I think it just means more like you use the tools that you have to make sense of the world. And every individual has kind of their own tools that are available to them. And so Kierkegaard used his own tools that were available to him to kind of uncover this version of this reading of Christianity versus the dominant reading. And he actually says, it's weird because, and I feel the same way myself, but he says, there are a few places where he says, I'm not a Christian. But he's referring to that Christendom kind of thing, because for most people, when they think Christianity, they think of what he calls Christendom. And he's like, I'm not a part of this. But then, what do you call what he's doing? Because it's all Christian stuff. He's pulling it all from Jesus. But he's like, I don't want to identify the Christendom thing. There's one part he said, like, something like, I think this was in the like weird title thing, like Philosophical Fragments or something to this effect. But he says the difficulty in previous times in being a Christian was that you had to become a Christian. But the difficulty today is that in order to be a Christian, you have to leave Christianity. But he's again talking about that Christendom thing. He's like, in order to be a Christian, you have to leave Christendom. And that is the hard part. So, it's like the word, and it doesn't mean, people for the vast majority of people, Christianity means the thing that they see on the corner. But then for him, it meant something quite different. And yeah, I loved that distinction of Christianity versus Christendom. So that helped me a lot. And then what's weird is that he was extremely influential with especially that existentialist trend, which is probably still the most dominant thing in at least European philosophy, I think. I don't know if within the United States we have more of an analytic perspective, and I don't think that existentialism is so dominant. But I think it is in Europe. at least the mainland, the continent of Europe, not so much England perhaps, but Germany, France, Netherlands, Belgium, et cetera, like that.
Yeah, so my impression, just to kind of maybe summarize and pull some things together, my impression of what Kierkegaard does, and maybe going back to the introduction with the reformers and everything, is that when the reformers sought to reform, they reformed some theological things, and it seems like a big deal to us as Protestants. Like, man, they got rid of icons, and those are big things in some sense, like in a visual sense. But the structure was still there, because now you basically just have a church that has its wealth and power, just with different groups of people under slightly different theologies and stuff. So it really wasn't all that revolutionary. What Kierkegaard does is far more revolutionary. And maybe, I don't know where the Anabaptists would be in this, because you've got nonviolence and certain groups throwing off the state completely, which is pretty revolutionary. You've got, I think it's the Hutterites or whatever, who share their wealth in common. I mean, the Anabaptists are doing some pretty revolutionary things, the various sects. But that's more like, I guess, what we see in Jesus, and that's something that started me down this path, was when I was like, man, everybody wanted to kill Jesus. People want to kill Christians in other countries. Like, why don't people want to kill me? And like, well, because we're part of the power system, and we're not revolutionary. We really aren't. So, I don't know. Maybe where we would go with this is, one of the themes that I've had throughout this season is kind of a false prophet versus a true prophet. And I think it was you who shared Reinhold Niebuhr's article, The King's Court.
I don't think so. I mean, I respect Niebuhr a lot, but I don't know that much about him.
Okay, well, he had this article like called something like The King's Court, but basically he's talking about how I think he was referring to Billy Graham when he was writing, but he's basically saying, you look in the Bible, and the prophets who are in the king's court aren't the good ones. The prophets who are in the wilderness tend to be the ones that are the good ones, because getting close to the power is not usually good. So I would say that Kierkegaard, there's a lot of self-sacrifice that he had to do. He knew what could happen because of his ideas. And he seems like a true prophet, because he's not calling people to easy things, and he's not speaking from a position of power. He's speaking from a position that's going to probably have people throw stones at him. Maybe you could talk about the importance of Kierkegaard as a true prophet as compared to false prophet.
Yeah. I was doing more research on the Kierkegaard thing, and this kind of pulls a little to the side, but I was just trying to find like a historical line, like, okay, Kierkegaard influenced who, and there is like a big historical line, but then this idea of kind of two Christianities, one of like the more powerful Christendom, but then another one that's a little bit harder, more prophetic, to pull from one of my favorite, one of the most helpful people, Cornel West, talks about the prophetic versus the Constantinian versions of Christianity. And that would, I mean, it's like, as you read deeper, you find it everywhere. So Niebuhr saying this thing about the King's Court makes so much sense. But actually before Kierkegaard, because I think he wrote that Attack Upon Christendom, which, by the way, it's the one thesis is that Christianity no longer exists. And his one task is to reintroduce Christianity to Christendom. And then he wrote Sickness unto Death and Training in Christianity, intending for them to be one book. And that was going to be subtitled Reintroducing Christianity to Christendom. That was his so Sickness unto Death and Training in Christianity were supposed to be together with that subtitle. I can't remember what he's going to call it, the title, but yeah, then it ended up getting split up and whatever. But he said that in 1855. In 1845, Frederick Douglass wrote his autobiography. He wrote it like 3 times, but his first autobiography. And at the very end of it, he wrote I think it's called the appendix, and he just says, what I have said respecting Christianity, I intend only to apply to the slave-holding Christianity of this land, not of the pure, peaceable. Can't remember all the adjectives he used to describe Jesus, but he's like, I consider them completely diametrically opposed system: the slave-holding Christianity of the United States versus the pure, peaceable Christianity of Christ. So then he has, and that was the earliest I could find of this two Christianities idea, 1845, which incidentally the same year that the Southern Baptist Convention left the American Missionary Baptists, because the American Missionary Baptists decided that they were not going to allow slaveholding pastors. And so all the slaveholders left the American Baptists to start the Slaveholding Baptist Convention, or Southern Baptist Convention, in 1845, the same year that Frederick Douglass wrote that thing about slaveholding Christianity. But it's very profitable. Slaveholding is extremely profitable. I feel like we don't acknowledge, and powerful Christianity in general is extremely profitable, and we forget that power can do a lot of things to justify itself. It can do a lot of charity to justify itself. I could talk about George Whitehead for a minute if you wanted, but because are you familiar with that story?
I don't think so.
Or it's Whitefield, actually. George.
Yeah, Whitefield. Yeah, he got slaves in order to fund an orphanage. Was that
right? Yes.
Yeah.
So, and that was that like similar time period. I think he was actually like nominally against slavery, but thought it's not that great of an idea. And then and he's trying to raise money for his orphanage, and somebody was like, "Well, here's 7 slaves," and he's like, "Okay, I'll treat him good." And then as soon as like it started working out for him, he was like, I like slavery, actually. And so Georgia, he even influenced Georgia to become a slave state. It was going to become like no black people allowed, basically. But then they were like, okay, we'll take black slaves, in large part because of George Whitefield. So
yeah, that's something that was the turning point for me. It was the thing that showed me. It just changed my mind on a lot of different things. Was this consequentialism that I saw? It started with Trump, where it's wait a second, like you're throwing off all this integrity because it's like, well, we got to win. Why? For abortion. It's like, well, yeah, but you're doing a bad thing to get something that you perceive as a good thing. Like that's still, you get how that's not a good thing, right? But they didn't. It's like I will do anything as long as the thing that I'm fighting against I perceive as more evil. And so you see it just, I think Christendom is filled with consequentialism. I think it runs on that as fuel.
Yeah, I totally. Yeah, I think as we look in history, we just see it over and over and over. And we don't realize, I think, that we inherit like the choices of the previous generation. And so we look and we say, why aren't there any black people in our church? And it's like, oh, it's because like the previous generation like literally ran them off. And so it wasn't me, or whatever, but it doesn't matter because like it was already done. It was chosen for you. We inherited this weird thing. Consequentialism. Good term.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's kind of sidetracked the Kierkegaard thing, but Frederick Douglass helped me understand that a little bit more. And then it's like it's been present throughout Christian history. But I think Kierkegaard might have been like the first to like really name it intensely, because also, like you said, the reformers, and I was very interested in the things you had to say about Zwingli because I haven't really looked into him very much, but yeah, Luther, I mean, he was passionate about a few things, and very thankful for the impact that he had, but then it was co-opted by much of the princes, and I don't know that like King James was a particularly good guy, but we owe a lot of the English Bible to him. Thinking of the Anglican Church, or thinking of any of the churches, just became a different version of the same. But there's also, I think there's the liberative parts and the oppressive parts of every tradition is kind of the way that there's priests and prophets.
Yeah, it's certainly not to say that everybody was bad, but you have a system that that is problematic. And it was interesting when you told me that a lot of Christians don't read Kierkegaard. That this Christian who has this internal critique, and I think people are doing the same thing with people who are deconstructing today, where it's like, well, they're not really Christians, so I don't have to listen to their critique because they're not true Christians. It's nice to be able to dismiss, so you don't really have to listen to those critiques and maybe change and apply. So kind of running with that a little bit earlier, we talked about brought in consequentialism and talked about how Kierkegaard is I perceive him as a true prophet. He might not have been right about everything, but he was trying to get the church right. One of the things that I think you see with true prophets are that they're idealists. And what I mean by that isn't that they're naive in the sense that they think that they're necessarily going to achieve the ideal, but they say, hey, look, this is the ideal. And even if I don't attain that, even if I don't affect the results, I'm not a consequentialist, and I'm going to cling to the ideal and pursue the ideal, even if I don't obtain that, because that's what Christians are supposed to do. Jesus, all of his teachings are essentially ideals. I'm not going to love my neighbor perfectly. Even in the most loving thing I do for them, there's probably some seed of self-interest involved that I can't weed out. So nevertheless, I pursue to love my neighbor more and more until hopefully I can weed that out, even if that's after I'm dead and resurrected. So maybe you could talk a little bit about Kierkegaard, and I don't know if you have any ideas about the ideal that kind of motivated him, that he latched onto, that drove him forward, and how that was important for him to have to deal with critique and hardship and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question, because I'm trying to think, okay, what was his ideal that he was after? And I think that it was perhaps so much in its infancy that I mean, it's like he just was trying to call people into a Christianity that was a little bit more aware, maybe. And it's almost like, yeah, it's a practice of seeing what it means to be good news to the poor, I think. I think because he saw the Christendom that was just excited about the wealth, excited about the domination, and people even there's a quote that you put in the notes about soldiers aspiring to be generals, and I think that he wanted to see a more soldier. Wait, and I think in the quote he says, "Were you going to bring this up later, or am I stealing your thunder right now?" Because he said something about not every soldier can be a general, but the best soldiers, everybody wants a soldier that aspires to be a general, but he's 99% of the soldiers are not going to become generals. So why do we put this fantasy on the soldiers to fail to? And what if we focused on becoming a more working class? There's a door that's about to slam right now. What if we aspired to be a more working class kind of have a more working class approach, I guess? Not that everybody's trying to become a billionaire or something like this, but that we could do something that values the common person. So I think that potentially Jesus and Kierkegaard are both advocating this. Just the prophets in general tend to be advocating good news to the poor, which is what Isaiah said, and then Jesus quoted, I think it's Luke 4, where he said, "I came to bring good news to the poor." And blessed are the poor, That's Luke. Matthew, of course, has the in spirit part, but then Luke doesn't. He just said, blessed are the poor, and then woe to you who are rich. So that's another part that I feel like never got mentioned that much, but in the Christianity that I grew up in, that there is like this poor and rich distinction. And I think that Kierkegaard was trying to bring that in. And it's, it can be scary for some people, but Kierkegaard and Marx both studied in Berlin at the same time in the same place. Kierkegaard interacted a little bit more with Feuerbach, who was like a little bit more focused on religion. But Kierkegaard and Marx also have the same birthday, May 5th. So Marx emphasizing this like workers thing, and then Kierkegaard advocating this like poor version of Christianity. I'm not sure that they're so different. And there is like a weird part where Kierkegaard says that it's also in his journals somewhere that he talks about like the secret that he never let out, except in one place, this one like book on Adler, it's called. And so I dug into book on Adler and was trying to think, what is the secret that he's talking about? And he makes a reference to Feuerbach, who in many ways like kind of ended the liberal version of Christianity, is kind of like before fundamentalism kind of ever became a dominant thing. It was kind of like Schleiermacher is the father of liberal Christianity, which is kind of like individualist. I don't know. It's hard to like summarize really shortly. And as soon as you start to talk about Kierkegaard, Feuerbach, Schleiermacher, Marx, everybody has like their thoughts on what each of those people were trying to do. And mine is potentially a little bit nuanced, but I think that Kierkegaard wanted to be the Feuerbach who stayed Christian. And in a way, Karl Barth he brings a bunch from Kierkegaard. He was a big fan of Kierkegaard. As far as I'm aware, I mean, there's probably a lot of Barthians out there that could do better on that topic than I could. But I think what Barth actually has a intro to Feuerbach where he says, yes, Feuerbach was right about Schleiermacher's Christianity. But he has not approached like the Christianity that Barth is talking about and Kierkegaard is talking about. So, and Marx builds off of Feuerbach's understanding. So anyways, I don't know, going into the weeds with that again, which is a thing that can happen. But what was the question again? Where were we?
It was Kierkegaard's ideal, what drove him. And
yeah,
I think you've been saying the poor was influential significantly. I think that's the gist so far.
So yeah, and I think that this like Feuerbach and Marxian, potentially more the ideal of Marx, not that he obtained it, but I was thinking as you were talking, I was thinking about Philippians 3 the whole time, where you said, because Paul says, what is it? I aspire to the resurrection of Christ and a fellowship in his suffering. Not that I have already obtained it, but I press on towards the goal. So Paul knows he's not perfect either, and I think that that's a humility piece that I think actually Kierkegaard, Feuerbach, and Marx actually, I think that they all have this. I don't know so much that Feuerbach has it exactly, but definitely Kierkegaard and Marx, I think they have this sense that of humility that like Marx goes back and revises a lot of his earlier writings, which is something that not that many people know, but that's the idea of that Hegel, who taught all of them. Kierkegaard didn't like Hegel, but it's kind of like a nuanced thing. And I think it was related to this Christendom versus Christianity thing. I think that Kierkegaard saw Hegel as part of Christendom, even though he had like some very influential ideas, like particularly historical materialism and the dialectic, or not historical materialism. That's Marx. It would just be the process of modernity, the dialectic of revising itself.
It's funny because, when you talk about philosophy, it sounds so elevated. but then when you start comparing philosophers, it sounds like a soap opera.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it is. I think it is. And it sounds elevated. And I was like, oh no. And if you are in those academic circles, man, I don't. It's the same as like a Christian thing. Like, how many angels can you fit on the head of a pin? And it's like, oh my gosh, like I don't think this even matters. And it's there's a lot of that. But I think once you are able to kind of get a grasp on something like Kierkegaard's idea of Christianity, I think that, but Kierkegaard was very much like individualist. I don't think I would almost say he's like a Christian version of Nietzsche in a way as well, which a lot of people probably wouldn't like to hear, but I read Nietzsche as much more Christian than many others do. Like, I think that you could put this Christianity versus Christendom idea on Nietzsche, though he is in a time period where he thinks that there's no reintroducing Christianity to Christendom, and he wants to scrap the whole language. He wants to scrap the whole thing and start over. Whereas Kierkegaard thinks that the Christian project can be reintroduced.
Yes. So,
and yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to go back just a little bit. It was interesting how you pulled out the poor from that quote on the military, whereas I kind of read a little bit further and pulled out a different emphasis on the end slightly. Yeah. But it reminds me a little bit of what you said with Paul in Philippians 3, where he knows he's not going to obtain perfection, yet he pushes on right towards the goal. And at the end of that quote that you were referencing with the generals and the enlisted men, Kierkegaard goes on to talk about how he's like, look, if the enlisted people don't desire to be generals, if everybody just enlists and they're like, well, I'm happy where I am, no moving up the ranks, I'm good. He's like, what kind of army are you going to have? You have all these unmotivated people who aren't becoming better soldiers, who aren't getting smarter, who aren't, jumping through the hoops of discipline that get them better. He's like, they're all going to die in the trenches, or that's what I envision. Because then he says that basically the church is saying to these people, hey, be tranquil. You're just like all the other soldiers. You're just like everybody else. You'll become blessed just like everybody else. No need to progress. And he says that that's a euphemism for, you're all going to hell like all the others, but this truth won't produce any money, and the other teachings pay brilliantly, to tell people that they're fine just where they are. And so that's what, in my mind, the ideal, maybe poverty was kind of a driving force socially for him, but it seems like, bringing up individualism, it seems like this individuality of, don't be like one of the masses. You are your own person who should be trying to become a general, should be progressing through the ranks, should be becoming more and more disciplined. So it seems like that makes a lot of sense with what you said. This self motivation towards being like Jesus, the general, whatever Jesus is.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, you could read this as a critique of Marxian thought, also, and it makes sense. But he doesn't name, I guess here he doesn't name, or does he? Doesn't name what his ideal that he's after is. He just says that he has one.
Right. Yeah, I didn't see a specific.
Yeah, and I think it's just so much. It's so much in its infancy, like the possibility. So he's just, which also is kind of prophetic in a way. Like, I feel like the prophets tend to be saying, love your neighbor, and you're not loving your neighbor, so your community is going to fall apart. But they don't exactly say like what will happen. I mean, like, God will show up, like something.
Yeah, I guess what they do a lot of times is they say, turn away from your idols or stop oppressing. They don't as far as I can think of it, there's not a whole lot of positive, because it's like, well, you know what God says that you're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just like, I know that this picture that I see in front of me is terrible. Stop doing that.
Right.
And so it seems like maybe that's what Kierkegaard is doing. He doesn't, I'm not that familiar with all his works, but I don't know that he puts forth a ton of positives so much as he attacks Christendom and just says, hey, we know that that's not good.
Yeah. 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 And I think I sympathize with the critique of that, saying, okay, well, what do you want me to do? Like, what are you about? If you're, I sympathize with that critique, but I actually just don't think that it's just a much more simple way. And maybe even that's a little key to existentialism in general, is that it's much more simple. Like what Kierkegaard is remembered by the secular readers is that he's just advocating a much simpler thing, which I think is existentialism. Not that it's easy, but it's simple.
Yeah, I mean, it's love justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. And Kierkegaard can say, that's not it. I'm okay.
Yeah, you're not loving justice. You're not walking humbly with your God.
I might not be able to give you a huge formula of what to do, but I know that you shouldn't be doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the quotes that I was thinking of when he says, "I'm not a Christian." This, like, he says, like, just because I can say that you're not a Christian doesn't mean I am a Christian, which, again, might be part of that, like, humility of, not that I've already obtained it, but I press on towards the goal of the Philippians 3 thing.
I
like
want
Kierkegaard.
Okay, I think this is actually the next one's the last question I have on Kierkegaard, I think. So I would consider myself a Christian anarchist, because I think every iteration of the state is terrible, because nobody does anything good with consolidated power. Well, I shouldn't say that you don't do anything good with it. I just think the bad is always going to be there in huge proportions. But Kierkegaard, I like Kierkegaard in part because he kind of rails against the state and points that out. And one of the things that I've talked about this season is, I don't know if you're familiar with David Graeber, but he talks about. Oh, okay, good. Yeah, and
Not so familiar, but I do like his work. I mean, yeah, I like his stuff.
I've seen a couple of his videos, and I've only read one of his book. I have some on my reading list, but they haven't fit for this season. But one of the things that I like that he says, that he points out, and it's probably not novel to him, but he says that there are essentially three methods that people use to control. They use power, information, and charisma. And it seems like, as a Christian, I can say, well, manipulating any of those three seems to distort God's intended order, because power becomes violence, manipulating information becomes deception or untruth, and manipulating charisma becomes seduction, right? Saying, bribing and seducing people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, that aren't good. Mm-hmm. This year, we are coming up into an election year in the States. And there aren't any groups chomping at the bit as much as conservative evangelical Christians are chomping at the bit to get their guy in power. Maybe girl, but probably guy. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Kierkegaard, maybe in relation to the state, in relation to power, and then help us to segue into what we're going to talk about next, which is, and then compare that to conservative Christians and our desire for power, and how that maybe pits us against the true prophets. How does it make us false prophets?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think that Kierkegaard's language gets co-opted by the conservative Christianity, whatever word we're going to use for that. Like this critique of the government that I also grew up with said, "Oh, we're all for small government," and then I realized, well, how come the military, we just want to massively increase this every chance we get? Like, here's unending, massive military presence globally, just absolutely nauseating the amount that we spend on blowing other places up. And so I was like, that's not small government, and so I became like a libertarian like pretty quickly. I don't think that they have a very good, like, later I kind of came to the conclusion I don't think they have a good answer for wealth inequality, and I think that that's probably one of the biggest problems we have today. So I don't identify as a libertarian anymore, but if coming from the Republican or conservative Christian perspective, I think that they co-opt this language of being against the government, which Kierkegaard certainly was, and it makes sense to have a kind of Christian anarchism and be connected to Kierkegaard. I think you can get that from Kierkegaard. And David Graeber, also very historically informed anarchist perspective, that isn't so crazy as I inherited the idea that anarchism was so crazy, but it's actually like makes a lot of sense. So it makes sense to me that Kierkegaard, but then thinking of the religious right and their demand for power, I think that especially if you look at the Southern Baptist Convention being the slaveholding Baptist Convention, they are not anti-government. Actually, they are very pro-government. And they left they left the American Baptists who wanted to critique it a bit more. And yet they would now say, "Oh, we're critiquing. We want to drain the swamp." Trump wants to drain the swamp, but it's almost like the little bit of kind of civil rights things. I think that is what they're actually draining. We know, I mean, we're talking about, I guess, the historical stuff, but the conservative Christians, Jerry Falwell in particular, got his start by being anti-civil rights, by saying that God ordained the separation of Black and white people, and that the decision to desegregate was anti-God. And then he started what became Liberty University as a whites-only segregation academy, like pretty openly. This is like they pulled their students out of the public school and started these segregation academies, and it tends to be Christian academies. What Christian meant was a segregation academy in most places. So their critique of government is actually the critique of like a little bit of justice being inserted. I don't know that desegregation was done perfectly. I don't think that it fixed many problems in the United States. I don't think that putting a Black Lives Matter sticker on your car is particularly effective at adding much justice to our world, but I think it's a little bit better than advocating segregation or saying we're not going to address those kind of social things.
Yeah, on that really quickly, I just read a book a few weeks ago called This Vast Southern Empire, which was fascinating to me because he says some of the things he gives examples of what you just said, where he's like, when the Civil War happened, you had tons of people, tons of Southerners that were in positions. He's like, they weren't in positions of agriculture. They were in positions related to the military and foreign affairs and those sorts of things, because they dominated and populated the areas that were going to expand the empire, in part because of slaveholding works well by expanding and having more places for slaves to be, but also to preserve to preserve slaveholding. So they were actually very big government, and a part of the reason that the early United States spread so much was Southerners who are theoretically about states' rights and not big federal government, yet they were the ones kind of fueling that. And then, another aspect that's always interesting to me is you've got these people who want states' rights, but then when it comes to when there's a slave that crosses state lines, that state that they cross into doesn't have the right to keep them there, right? They have to give them back, right? No states' rights. So yeah, exactly what you said makes a lot of sense. I grew up small government. It doesn't work out that way. I think the first president I voted for was Bush 2, and he upped the debt by bajillions.
Yeah. And I think we were living in the same building at that time, and I think that the same thoughts were probably in our worlds. That was just like, this is not actually small government. Like, if we're about small government, which I think is a kind of a noble ideal, Republicans aren't doing it, or the conservative Christian thing is not advocating small government. I think they're just against the community aspects, actually. So as I've drifted more, to the left, whatever that means to whatever the people, I think that I've seen that they want big community and small government. And the conservative Christianity that I grew up in wants big government, small community. But we use the right uses government for community, and then the left uses the word community for government. I don't know. Do you know what I'm saying? What am I trying to say?
Yeah. We like a big government to be in other countries and on other people's doorsteps, to make sure that it ensures my personal wealth and freedom here to do what I want to do. I don't care if that other person in that other country doesn't get to do what they want to do or live. But you're saying for the left, it would be more like, no, keep our military here. Let's spend on making infrastructure better. Let's spend on childcare so that we can help parents out in communities.
Yeah. So that's the way I see it now. I'm for small government, big community. But I feel like that was flipped. There's no distinction between community and government, I suppose. There's not enough of a distinction. And then I think the centrist perspective is maybe more dumb than both, which is maybe we can just have a little bit of slavery. How about that? Maybe we can just let the South have slaves and the North will, it's not great, actually. But what if we just stick a Black Lives Matter sticker on, what if we rename the street after Martin Luther King? How about that? It's not gonna, probably not particularly a good symbolic victory, but it's not very much significant.
Right. I want to build a bridge now to the next century. Well, I guess it's kind of partly the 19th century, but going into the 20th. Yeah. And this is more your wheelhouse, so I'm sure you'll have at it here. But for me, I'm still an evangelical. Like you said, I don't know what to call myself. Am I conservative, evangelical? It depends. Are you talking theologically, morally, various sorts of things? I don't know what I am, but I am in an evangelical denomination, and I agree with a lot of the theology. But the orthopraxy, I have some big problems with. And so I want to focus on that group. We could focus on where Kierkegaard goes for a lot of different groups of people, but this is my group, and I want to create some internal critique for myself and for my group. So I want you to maybe build a bridge from Kierkegaard into the late 19th century and early 20th, and get us to the rise of fundamentalism, which then will lead into evangelicalism. And specifically, I know you like to bring up Dwight Moody, so maybe have him as a main character here.
Yeah. So this is kind of like the master's thesis that I wrote was, I discovered a book called Guaranteed Pure by Tim Glegg, talking about Moody Bible Institute and business and Christianity and how it all tied together. and he just had like kind of this like half chapter or so talking about the Haymarket affair and how Dwight Moody was a big winner in that moment, because so we'll like start a little bit further back. Cyrus McCormick Sr. had this was in 1832, which is a big year for a lot of things. It's also the year that Emerson decided not to be a pastor. It's like kind of my other thing I'm really excited about is the American Transcendentalists, of which Ralph Waldo Emerson is kind of the most famous. He decided to not be a pastor anymore, to be a better pastor is what he wrote in his journal that year. But that same year, Cyrus McCormick Sr. and the person that he enslaved named Joe Anderson developed the grain harvester, this thing that could be pulled behind a horse. And it was kind of the first year that it was successful in accomplishing what they wanted it to accomplish, which was just a massive rate. It's just way more efficient than what had been done before. And so it became marketed, and he got really McCormick got really wealthy off of this. Joe Anderson, not so much. But what McCormick Sr. did with a lot of his wealth was he tried to advocate for the slaveholding Christianity. He even started a seminary in Chicago called McCormick Theological Seminary that was intended to be kind of a bastion of Southern slaveholding Christianity in Chicago in the North. He went to Chicago because it was geographically well situated to get his, he could get wood and resources on, is it Lake Michigan, the Great Lakes? It's like the Great Lakes. I don't know. I've never been to Chicago. Only one time it was the airport. But it was well situated to get his harvester to Farmers West and the resources that he needed to build lots and lots of these grain harvesters. And he used that to advocate against Abraham Lincoln. In fact, they were born, I think, in the same year, and they just like butted heads constantly, McCormick Sr. and Abraham Lincoln. Eventually, McCormick, even his theological seminary, ended up turning on him. They started becoming abolitionists, and he'd pull his money out, and he was like kind of upset that he was creating abolitionists by advocating Christianity. So yeah, I think that's a cool part of the story, that it kept flipping on him. And eventually he loses, right? And Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Joe Anderson is freed, and McCormick Sr. he did buy a house for him somewhere. I'm not sure where, and Joe Anderson like dies in obscurity. And McCormick is obviously still a big deal. He passes off his grain harvester thing to his son, Cyrus McCormick Jr. And one of the first things that Cyrus McCormick Jr. does is he starts bringing in like all these kind of machines so he can make, he's way more profitable than he was before, and he needs less people, and even the workers that were there are becoming more and more efficient. And they're saying, hey, what if we have the 8-hour workday? Because we're good at what we do. We don't need to work these 10-hour days, 6 days a week anymore. And it would probably be better for our community if we had more time to do things. And McCormick Jr. was like, coming from the slaveholding Christianity, I think that the origins of McCormick's thing we owe to a lot to his father's slaveholding Christianity perspective, that God gave me money and I get to choose how I spend it, and more profit is good for me, more money, and so more charity potentially, or not, whatever the case may be. And so he decides to fire half of his people and make the rest of them work more and harder. A lot like Pharaoh and Moses. But Cyrus McCormick Jr., like his father before him, is advocating, he's using Christian words to do this stuff. And he has a good friend named Dwight Moody who keeps saying, I want to start a Bible school to advocate this personal, plain, practical approach. And so the people of Chicago protest on May 1st, 1886, becomes a big deal.
We celebrate that here in Europe, not so much in the States, huh?
It's so weird. Yeah, it's very weird. And in fact, Joe Biden, the Marxist communist that apparently he is, I don't think he has anything to do with any of those things, but he actually declared May 1st Loyalty Day. So it's not even they want to distract from this event. And what happened was the people of Chicago are protesting, the workers of Chicago are protesting and saying, this is unjust. We should be building a community that works for everybody. And instead, we're like making some people extremely wealthy and most people extremely poor. But McCormick doesn't care, and the police, it just doesn't make sense to people, whatever. So people are protesting. McCormick hires strike breakers. Becomes, a yelling match, potentially some violence, whatever. The police come in on May 3rd and kill 4 protesters. The next day, May 4th, they have a thing, a demonstration in Haymarket Square. And a preacher, actually, Samuel Fielden, is giving the talk saying that God cares about the workers. I don't know that he's being explicitly theological, but his theology certainly informs his advocating for the people, for the working people, as opposed to McCormick Jr. Somebody throws a bomb. The police come in, then somebody throws a bomb, and the police open fire on everybody. And I think the possibly agreed upon is that it's about 200 and something wounded and about, I think it's 14 dead. Samuel Fielding gets shot as he's trying to run away. But McCormick and the police and everybody just have this big panic that the workers are just getting out of line. And so they know who the activists are, and they arrest hundreds, but they end up sentencing 8 to death. 4 of those people are killed. I think the only one that was present at the time of this moment was Samuel Fielden, who was preaching or giving the talk, but he gets sentenced to death, just like the 7 others, who all actually advocate anarchism, or are connected and sympathetic towards anarchism, because they think that the government of the time is not great, the Cyrus McCormick Jr. government. And so Moody then uses this moment to say, hey, Cyrus McCormick, you need me to put a Bible school in, and I will train Christian workers. I will tell people that, they should submit to you. He does actually have a little critique for McCormick Jr. I have to give him that. Like, he thinks that the firing of half of the workforce was pretty unjust. Cyrus McCormick's mom also says, yo, that's not that cool what you did, and you're going to create problems. But he kind of just goes for it and like does the hard thing and fires everybody, and then kind of slightly moderates, but not really. So then Moody, then with this massive, I think it was like $100,000, which is, a lot at that time period, starts the Chicago Evangelization Society, which we now know as the Moody Bible Institute. It's renamed when Moody died to the Moody Bible Institute, 1899. He died December 1899. Actually, a big controversy moment, but we won't get into that. So you have the Moody Bible Institute, but it's the Christendom. It's Cyrus McCormick Jr.'s version of Christianity, not Samuel Fielden's version of Christianity. Samuel Fielden's Christian anarchism, even. So from the Moody Bible Institute, they hire Reuben Archer Torrey. Reuben Archer Torrey actually gets mixed up. This is a scandal. The scandal is that he didn't believe in medicine at the time period, and so his daughter got really sick, 8-year-old daughter Elizabeth, and he said, "I'm just going to pray. God is going to heal her. I'm not going to give her the medicine." And at the last moment, he realizes, oh my God, I think she's going to die. Calls in the doctor. The doctor comes. It's too late. The girl dies. 8-year-old girl dies. And everybody that knows the situation is just like, what are you doing? Dwight Moody was not against medicine. In fact, he was like, we need to medicine is a good thing. We should bring this in. And so he differed with Torrey on this. That's why there was a big controversy at Moody's death. And Torrey actually decides that it was his wavering is what killed his daughter. So his lack of faith in the last moment, he called in the doctor and he said, that was my problem. God was going to save her, whatever. But there's a disagreement and problems. And so Torrey needs out. He first goes on a world speaking tour. He speaks all over the world. But then this guy named Lyman Stewart, who is very wealthy from 76/Union Oil, he's a Pennsylvanian, but living in Los Angeles and upset at he's trying to control Occidental Bible College, which is it's a very prestigious school in Los Angeles. And he was donating $3,000 a year to their Bible department. He wanted like a Dwight Moody style Bible department at Occidental College, but the people were like, no, you can't just donate money and then dictate who gets hired, who gets fired, etc. So he says, all right, screw you guys. I'm starting my own Bible Institute. I'm going to call it the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, modeled after the Moody Bible Institute. I like what, Cyrus McCormick, and I like Dwight Moody's version of Christianity. So let's do Biola, is what it's today called, Biola University. And then he hears a guy named Amzi Dixon, whose brother is Thomas Dixon, who wrote a book called The Klansman. And basically Thomas Dixon was kind of the book, The Klansman, then becomes an early movie called Birth of a Nation, which like revitalized the KKK. So Thomas Dixon's brother, Amzi Dixon, is a preacher that Lyman Stewart polls and says, okay, R.A. Torrey and Amzi Dixon, I want you to create these documents that are basically Moody's Christianity, but like none of this like social stuff. We don't want people advocating like the Samuel Fieldin thing. Of course, they don't know who Samuel Fieldin is, but none of this like Christian anarchism, none of this Christian advocating for working people. They need to submit to the divine authority that those of us with money have. And so Lyman Stewart pays for 700,000 copies of these to be sent to everybody that they can get an address for. And they're called the Fundamentals, which is where we get the term fundamentalism from.
So I want to make sure that I'm understanding this, because there are lots of names and things thrown around. Yeah. So tell me if the summary is correct. The brother or cousin, I guess brother, of the guy who made the film Birth of a Nation that revitalized the KKK worked with the like founder or whatever of Biola to create the fundamentals that basically jump-started what we know of as fundamental Christianity today.
Yes. Yep. That is, yeah. And Amzi and his brother Thomas they're both Southern/slaveholding Baptists. So it's not crazy. Lyman Stewart and the McCormicks were Presbyterians. But Moody is basically the origin of non-denominational Christianity. So he's like, we're not going to mess with the denominational stuff. And so it was like the conservative Presbyterians and the conservative Baptists that were trying to build this movement of fundamentalists, and it didn't quite work out. And it really fizzled out at the Scopes trial when William Jennings Bryan, who's actually kind of a Christian socialist, he was very theologically conservative, but was for big community and thought that the government should intervene. It's a very weird thing. William Jennings Bryan, he had the whole thing at the Scopes trial, which was a controversy over whether or not evolution should be taught in schools. But Clarence Darrow, who was the attorney against William Jennings Bryan, he was advocating like that science, / evolution should be taught in schools. Ended up William Jennings Bryan didn't have like a good interpretation of Genesis chapter 1. He had a very face value interpretation of Genesis 1, and it just was seen as kind of a laughing stock. And William Jennings Bryan died 5 years later, which is crazy. He was 3-time candidate for president. He lost every time, but big advocate for fundamentalist Christianity, which is weird because he was also conservative theology, but more of a Christian socialism, which is also the same for the What Would Jesus Do person. His name was Charles Sheldon, is also an advocate of Christian socialism. That's what the What Would Jesus Do thing was about, to advocate for a society rather than profit, people over profit. So fundamentalism, though, defined, there are 5 points, which was inerrancy of scripture, which I think for them actually meant like Dwight Moody's I call it the Moody McCormick gospel because I don't think it would have been a big deal if it was only Moody, but because McCormick was the funding behind it. I think it was his plain interpretation. He didn't want to look at the historical, the social, or the literary context, which was what the seminaries were really arguing about at that time period. And Kierkegaard would have been, he wasn't in seminary, but he would have, he's advocating a historical or a social look at Christianity. Whereas the fundamentalists wanted to just get rid of that historical social thing and just think about, okay, I want to read this one verse and then say, what does it mean to me? And then that's how I'm going to go. So like, that's what the slaveholding Christians did as well. It's, Ephesians 6:5 says, slaves, be obedient to your masters. And they're like, that settles it. Slaves, be obedient to your masters, pro-slavery. Then you have to look at the Exodus and you're like, is the Exodus slaves being disobedient to their masters? Because, um, so I think that there's like the historical and social context gets discarded by the fundamentalists, and they start to, a big thing also, weirdly or not, was about the virgin birth of Christ, because historical and social scholars start to look at the Greek understanding of what it meant to be born of a virgin. Like Plato was considered to be born of a virgin, and it meant that he was like this elevated figure, and only Matthew and Luke reference the virgin birth of Christ. And so the historical and social scholars start to say Mary wasn't technically a virgin. This is Matthew and Luke's way of saying that Jesus is really important, that Greek people in particular would really understand. So then they kind of discard this idea about, or they say it's not important, whether or not Mary was technically a virgin, but that becomes one of the fundamentalist doctrines. But really what it's about is is historical or social context important? Literary context, is that important to understanding what the Bible has to say? And Dwight Moody wants the Moody McCormick gospel, the Reuben Archer Torrey / Lyman Stewart gospel of Biola of fundamentalism says our plain interpretation is the authority, not the historical, social, literary thing, because wow, that is a can of worms when you open that up, and then all of a sudden you're starting to advocate for these workers who get paid whatever I want to pay them, not what is quote just. That's just way too much.
So then you would view the inerrancy thing as kind of a cementing of the inability to question them.
Yes. So yeah, there's 5 points, and I have them here. I could pull them up real quick, but each of them, inerrancy is number 1, but I think that's more Moody McCormick's face value interpretation, which also I don't want to say literal also, because I think that literal is a problematic term, because I think I take the Bible very literally, but I disagree quite a bit with Moody and McCormick's face value interpretation. But most people think of this in the literal versus metaphorical. I don't like to think of it that way. I think of it as face value versus socially, historically, and literary informed. But yeah, there's 5 main points of fundamentalism, and it's really just trying to cut out that social, historical, and literary perspective of the Bible. So then fundamentalism kind of falls apart in 1925, and they're kind of seen as uninformed, anti-intellectual, anti-science. But then in the humanities, it's well, you don't want the historical, you don't want the social, you don't want the literary perspective on things. You just want the perspective that says, you're God's chosen people. And so there's many Bible institutes that are started at this time period, and they start to transition from being called Bible institutes to be called colleges. So our alma mater, Cedarville, is one of these places that was started, 1880 something. But it becomes Cedarville College at this point, rather than Cedarville. I don't know what it was originally called, actually, but there's a lot of these that were started to be fundamentalist kinds of places. And there's a great book written on this called Fundamentalist You by Adam Lotz. And he just kind of shows that like they were created to like cut out science, to cut out the wrong parts of history. It's very frustrating to me that I didn't know this before, because I would have probably chosen differently, even though I'm happy to have met you and happy to have met the people that I met at Cedarville. But it was kind of a university built on cancel culture, which I'm not really a fan of on the right or the left. But the right, in my living experience, the right has done much more canceling than the left has done. Whatever the left means, because I don't know that term, it means too many different things to too many different people. Same thing with the right too. We'll just be honest about that. But yeah, like fundamentalism was basically just a cancel culture kind of a movement.
Yeah, and it might not fit in because I don't really know that much about him, but I know somebody that you've talked about before was J. Gresham Machen, and I just looked up he started Westminster Theological, which is big in my denomination. He started that in 1929, so right after the Scopes trial and the fundamentals and all that stuff.
Yeah. So, and I love the J. Gresham Machen story because it shows how much of a hypocrite he was. And it just illustrates so well. But he was probably the most. He was advocating with what's the other guy's name at Princeton. Princeton was the seminary that was like had the most Southern people at it, even though it's in New Jersey. But like the McCormicks, if I remember right, yeah, actually they both went to Princeton. McCormick Sr. and McCormick Jr., I believe, both went to Princeton. And it was kind of, what's the terminology? It was I'm so disappointed I'm forgetting the names, because you would know this name. I think it was called old school theology or something like that. And there was this guy, I think it was Charles somebody, in the 1880s. So before.
Was it Finney? Charles Finney?
No, Finney. No, he's
Spurgeon.
he was an abolitionist, not Spurgeon. I forget the guy's name. He's at Princeton.
Ryrie.
No. There's a guy at Princeton. I think the movement that he was about was called, I think it was called old school theology. Like, let's see if it comes up. Princeton theology was a tradition of conservative, blah, blah, blah. B.B. Warfield. That's not the guy, but you heard of him before. Charles Hodge. That's what it is. Charles Hodge. So Charles Hodge and J. Gresham Machen were the conservative side of Princeton Theological Seminary, and Princeton wanted to become more open. Machen was not okay with that, and so he wrote kind of the defining book, I would say, of this fundamentalist versus modernist / liberal Christianity, that was called, forgetting it now again, Christianity and Liberalism. I think that's what's called, Christianity and Liberalism. And his like thesis statement is that liberal Christianity is not Christianity at all. And I sympathize with him because I'm not a huge fan of liberal Christianity. But I am less of a fan of fundamentalist Christianity. And so he advocates, he's like going after kind of Walter Rauschenbusch, who I think is a pretty great, he was the guy behind the social gospel. So he's advocating the social context of Christianity, which is, I think, something that Kierkegaard also would have probably advocated. But the social gospel, just saying that God, like the kingdom of heaven should come to earth and we should change what's happening on earth. Whereas the fundamentalists tended to see everything happening after we die. Like there's a big part of fundamentalism was also dispensationalism, the like rapture idea. That was another thing that Lyman Stewart paid for, was this book by William Blackstone called Jesus is Coming. He also sent it out to everybody, and it was kind of like the Left Behind idea. We didn't have very much time. Jesus is coming back soon, so it's just all about like getting as many people to pray this Dwight Moody kind of prayer. That's what Christianity is about, and there's no time to do social stuff, and the world is going to go, it's going to all be burned anyways. So don't worry about social stuff. Just try to convert people. Walter Rauschenbusch disagreed, and he called his thing the social gospel. What was I saying? Oh, J. Gresham Machen. And J. Gresham Machen then says in the introduction, it's all in the introduction of his book, that the social gospel is not Christianity at all. In fact, it's like the gospel is all about individual rights. It comes from the South, Princeton being the like Southern seminary in the North. But then I was like, because I knew like he's writing this in 1929, right? So I was like, that was not long after women got the right to vote. So I wonder, was he like in favor of women having individual rights? No, he was not. Like he advocated against women having the right to vote. And then I knew, like, of course, there's race things happening. So was he against black? Was he an advocate of black people having individual rights? No, he was not advocate. He was, in fact, he has this letter that he wrote to his mom about how much he hated that black people were allowed in the dorms at Princeton now. And so I look at his thing and I'm saying, okay, what individual rights are you talking about? And it's very clear from his historical context that he's advocating for like the wealthy, the elite, which is, you know, the same thing as Cyrus McCormick. Even though he disagreed with many aspects of fundamentalism, he thought that they were kind of too plain. And so they needed a more doctrinally sound, and he didn't think fundamentalism was doctrinally sound. But he landed on the fundamentalist side of the debate, I guess, because he was for individual rights, but not the individual rights of women and not the individual rights of black people. So, yeah, I think that illustrates to me the problem with that states' rights thing, because it's like states' rights to what? And Liberty University, liberty for what? And it was liberty to exploit other people, and liberty to not think about the poor in spirit is what I would say. It was, so it's, to me, it's anti-gospel. Even though it uses the words of Christianity, it is Christendom. To go back to Kierkegaard, it's not Christianity, it's Christendom.
Yeah,
so that was Machen.
Because they were basically, putting forth a theology that I know in our circles, this the social gospel was a pejorative term, to say that it's devoid of content. But then I was introduced to a word later, orthopraxy, and I'm like, oh, well, it seems like that's kind of what the social gospel is. And it's like, well, maybe you need a theological and a social gospel. Like, if you want to say that you need both of those things, that's great. But like, the social gospel is a part of the gospel.
Yeah, and I think that I think that's a big reason why I left the evangelical fundamentalist tradition, is just because I saw them blasting the social gospel. I didn't see them including it. And so somehow their theology was cutting it out. Whereas, yeah, like I never heard of Walter Rauschenbusch. And I didn't know, like, Walter Rauschenbusch was a huge influence on Martin Luther King. And so, yeah, but then I discovered, I guess the next part of the story is that, so from 1925 until 1949, fundamentalism kind of goes underground. They just focus on their Bible colleges. At least that's the story that's told. I know there's some people that contest that, but that's like the years, like the mainline denominations became like, I mean, they were already strong. Like the mainline denominations were, yeah, they were strong. Those mainline / liberal Christians really invested in the social sphere. So they started like public schools. They started a lot of public things. They were very involved in FDR's New Deal. So they were advocating like society. They were advocating for like the infrastructure project, big community. They're advocating big community. And they weren't so particular about whether things were called Christian or not. They were just like, we want to make the world a better place. And they did, but business people, in the tradition of Cyrus McCormick Jr. and Lyman Stewart, were not huge fans of this. And they didn't like that the like fundamentalists or their kind of projects of maximizing profit were being excluded from the mainline denominations. So they started basically, but they agreed. Many agreed that fundamentalism was problematic. Like, it was too militant, it was too angry, and so like I think one of the most respectable advocates of what became evangelicalism, he's kind of the founding father of it, is this guy named Carl F.H. Henry. You heard of him?
No.
Um, it was kind of, from what I understand, it was kind of like Carl Henry, um, this guy at Gordon Conwell. What was his name? Gordon Conwell Seminary in Boston, and Billy Graham, that kind of were able to build their first. Well, there was fundamentalists that wanted to like regain fundamentalism, but they saw like Carl Henry wanted a like fundamentalist theology, but then liberal social impact, something to this effect. Anyways, this is so he tried to make like a middle way of what he wanted to call evangelicalism, and they kind of like pulled from Charles Finney, because Charles Finney was somebody that a lot of people agreed with, especially in the non-denominational. He was an abolitionist before it was cool. He was preaching like Moody. He wasn't so tied in with denominations, so they like Charles Finney. And Charles Finney, I think, is like the like main person behind the word evangelical. Also, there's a college that did he start? Oberlin College, very kind of socially aware, and Christian, at least at that time. And Wheaton was one of these colleges also, but then getting into the weeds again. But Wheaton actually ended up getting a fundamentalist president. So he became fundamentalist. I guess he's probably like a William Jennings Bryan type that was theologically conservative, but wanted to maybe be a little bit socially liberal. I'm unaware exactly. But Wheaton has its roots in the Charles G. Finney. Is that Second Great Awakening? I think it's the Second Great Awakening. Um, and so Billy Graham, Carl Henry, and the other person whose name I'm forgetting from Boston, they started the National Association of Evangelicals. And Moody wanted to Billy Graham wanted to preach this kind of just simple message of Dwight Moody. I mean, I think it wasn't. He said often that he wanted to revive the spirit of Dwight Moody, and it wasn't a particular intellectual thing. You know, Dwight Moody was not intellectual. Neither was Billy Graham. There's like a funny story that um, that I so Billy Graham has it. He actually Charles Templeton. Do you know about Charles Templeton?
No.
Him and Billy Graham were buddies, and they were the first people to get hired by Youth for Christ in the 40s. We also have to remember that this was the time of World War II, so like people were really desperate for people to like to hear messages. It's also the time of C.S. Lewis. Like C.S. Lewis is on the radio in London. Billy Graham and Charles Templeton are touring the United States, like giving talks to people and kind of advocating some morality during the war against the Nazis. And so Charles Templeton's from Canada, Billy Graham's from North Carolina, and they're charismatic, fun, engaging, you know, have good music. They have like a big production kind of thing that shows up. But neither Graham nor Templeton is educated. And they're becoming world tour preachers. And they're starting to have like behind the scenes talks like, we're about to speak to 10,000 people, and like we have a little bit of doubts. We have got some questions about what we're about to say. And so Templeton is actually like, I just got into Princeton. Billy, let's go to Princeton. And Billy Graham was like, that would be awesome, but I'm the president of Northwest Bible College. Even though like I don't really have like a formal seminary training, I haven't dealt with this like historical criticism thing. I don't really know. Like, he's like, so Billy says, let's go to Oxford. Let's go to Oxford. Then like that's prestigious enough that it wouldn't like conflict with my being the president of Northwest Bible College. But Templeton is already in Princeton Seminary. And so Templeton goes and Billy Graham doesn't. And they actually meet up again in Southern California, where I used to go to summer camp, a place called Forest Home. And they're at like a little conference. It was like 1 year into Templeton's time at Princeton. And Templeton's talking about all the like historical stuff that he's learning. And Billy's like, oh my gosh, this is big. You know, if like the virgin birth idea, if it's just signaling, if it shouldn't be face value interpreted, then what else am I wrong about? And he's having this question. And then he writes in his first authorized biography that he was on a late night walk in the woods, and he's like wrestling with this, and he's supposed to give a big conference in Los Angeles coming up, and he's like, I don't know if I can do it, conflicted. And he's like, and then I had the thought that how's it go? He's like, I don't know how a brown cow can eat green grass and produce white milk, but I drink it. Therefore, I'm going to preach the Bible the way I know to preach because it works. You know,
Kierkegaardian leap of faith. He must be a Kierkegaard fan, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so he's like, you know what? I'm fully committed. He goes to Los Angeles. He preaches. Radio personality gets converted. And then, what was his name? The guy behind yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst. Yellow journalism is like a term for like shady journalism, not particularly aware, but like propaganda. I suppose maybe not full propaganda. But the guy who's most known for yellow journalism, William Randolph Hearst, sends a note out to all his newspapers, Puff Graham, 2 words, Puff Graham. And so then the next day, Billy Graham is everywhere. The Los Angeles Crusade just like explodes. And then now evangelicalism is like on the scene, and Billy Graham is like this savior. It launches him into a meeting with first Harry Truman, but he kind of blows it with Harry Truman. He like is not confidential about their conversation. So Truman has not very many good things to say about Billy Graham, but Dwight Eisenhower loves Billy Graham and thinks that he needs a God component, specifically a Christian component to his campaign to contrast with the Soviet Union. And so he says, all right, Billy, like you're in, I'm going to get baptized by you. So he's the first president to get baptized. And Dwight Eisenhower, by the way, is named Dwight because of Dwight Moody. He's named Dwight after Dwight Moody. His mom chooses that. And so Eisenhower then adds "In God We Trust" to money, and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 50s. And it's after the war, economics is going great. And so like even like liberal people, they're like, that's a great idea. You know, there's no contest to that.
Yeah, and he started presidential prayer breakfast too, right?
Yes. Yep. Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, if I'm remembering right, at least part of the cabinet, was a guy named Richard Nixon. And Billy Graham gets like really connected with Richard Nixon, like really likes him. But Billy Graham is actually also a Democrat. He's from the South, and Eisenhower's Republican, but he kind of just decides like it doesn't matter that much, you know, whether you're Republican or Democrat, whatever. But he never changed his voter registration, so he was Democrat till the day he died, actually. Or you know, I don't know. He never became a Republican. Let's just say that. And I don't think that he ever officially left the Democrats. He's also good friends with Lyndon Johnson. But every president since Eisenhower to Obama basically had Billy Graham as part of his kind of King's Court. Like, even Obama like had several meetings with Billy Graham, and like they prayed together and did all kinds of things together. Clinton, of course, as well. So yeah, that's kind of the story of Billy Graham. But then also what I didn't realize is that Billy Graham was also at the same time as Martin Luther King, and he was cordial with Martin Luther King, and especially in the beginning, he invited Martin Luther King to pray at one of his crusades up in New York City, and Martin Luther King did, and it was a big problem for the fundamentalists. They didn't like, Billy Graham wasn't militant enough for them, even though he pretty much shared their theology. He was not aggressive enough, and he got kicked out of Pensacola Bible College way back in the day, Billy Graham. But then where did he finish? I can't remember where he finished. He did do like a degree in like sociology or anthropology or something like that, but I don't know that he had any academic training beyond that. It was from a Bible college, if I remember right.
Yeah, I know. I just actually listened to Fundamentalist U because you had it recommended, and I thought it would be good prep. I'm pretty sure he was at Bob Jones at one point because it talks about how Bob Jones wanted to have him preach before he got big.
Yes. Maybe that's what it's not Pensacola. It was Bob Jones, I think, that he got kicked out of. Or did he? I don't know. But it was so early in Billy Graham's process that I wouldn't put so much weight on it. Just that, like, that's what he comes from. In fact, the place where he got saved was like a big tent revival with like a very racist preacher. I can't remember that guy's name, but you can look up like how did Billy Graham get saved, and it was at a big tent revival with a like extremely racist person that he later tried to distance himself from, but I mean, the theology is the same, just like, and Billy Graham had like some moments where, he like took down the rope separating the white and black people. But then he also had moments where he, like kept the ropes up and went to like, I think it was in Dallas that he, like one of the biggest segregationists, like he spoke at the church and, took pictures with this guy. And then when Martin Luther King said, I have a dream that little black children will hold hands and play with little white children, Billy Graham responded with, only when Christ comes again will little black children, little white children play together. And he wrote like opinion pieces saying that Martin Luther King needs to put the brakes on. What else did he do? He did a lot. Basically, he said, he has his crusades. Well, I have legal crusades in stadiums. So, he has his protests. Well, I have legal protests in stadiums.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of Falwell's Ministers and Marchers, where he's kind of railing against like, no, we don't do that sort of thing. Like we have our church, and we don't kind of delve into those politics. And then of course, a little bit later he does a complete 180. But this is definitely an interesting time. I really like Kevin Kruse's book, One Nation Under God, for this time period. I think that was the first evangelical one that I really looked at, and I was like, oh man, there's a whole lot more. Like this is going to uncover a whole lot. And so I've read quite a bit since then. But it's just, a not so comfortable period to look at if you're an evangelical.
Yeah, and that was the thing that I guess I kept uncovering was just that, and especially like the Southern Baptists are easy to kind of rail against because they were on the wrong side. And actually they've like fully admitted it in 2018 that they were on the wrong side of basically every justice movement that has ever occurred. And then, so for me, that's like, well, is it possible that you're advocating a Christendom and not Christianity? Is it possible that you're like this theology that you're advocating is actually antichrist? And that you've turned Christ into a figure that he's not, that Kierkegaard talks about saying like the Christ that says, come and follow me is a quite different version, as opposed to, and not that like liberal Christianity is much better, but, I mean, I guess I advocate more the social gospel things. And it's kind of like about the fruit, I think. Jesus talks about, you will know them by their fruit. First John says is it First John? It says they will know we are Christians by our love.
First John talks a ton about love. I'm not sure if that's where it is. I know Jesus in the gospel says that they'll know you're my disciples by the way you love one another.
Yeah. So that's the Gospel of John then. But yeah, so I like by their fruit you will know them. And I just don't think the fruit of the Southern Baptist Convention is very good. And I don't think the fruit, while there is a lot of charity, there's not that much justice in the like post fundamentalist evangelical tradition. Like I would keep Charles Finney out of it. Though places like Wheaton College, they try to connect themselves to the Charles Finney Second Great Awakening kind of a thing. And I think that that version, that's like Mark Knoll. Do you know Mark Knoll? I think he tries to connect himself to that version of evangelical as opposed to the like fundamentalist version of evangelical, but they've gotten so mixed up, and it's hard to separate that Second Great Awakening evangelicalism from the evangelicalism that we see today.
I think that's you identified something there that's been really difficult for me, because if something's good, it should lead to good results. And I think what a lot of people in my group, the whatever evangelicals, I think what they often try to do is they look back at all of those bad social decisions, moral decisions, and they view them as individual instances of we got that one wrong. We got that one wrong. Whereas I think what Kierkegaard helps me to do is he looks at Christendom and a history of bad decisions as systematic. And I mean, just look at today. My group, by and large, if you take the 80% that voted for Trump, and if they're representative of this type of kind of thinking, they can't accept something like systemic racism. Like that just does not compute for them. And so, of course, our history of bad results isn't systemic. It's just, well, they made individual bad decisions.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, when I looked at the history, I saw that excuse over and over and over, and I was just like, I can't like stay in this. And so like I'm sort of part of the Quakers now, and I just went to a Quaker meeting in San Diego last weekend, and I think I told them like, yeah, like I want to be a part of this because you all have been on the right side of history for your entire history. And that's not something I could say about like the churches that I grew up in.
Side note, I actually interviewed a Quaker historian in my season on nonviolent action, because there's this Quaker guy named Benjamin Lay who is like amazing. But she kind of burst my bubble because she was like, well, it wasn't always so clear, these Quakers were fighting with those Quakers and this, and I was like, okay, well, they're still at least really good. They might not be perfect, and they more than other people self-correct. It seemed it's like, okay, you had a bunch of people get into power who owned slaves, but you remedied that. Maybe it took you 50 or 100 years, which is a long time to enslave people, but you had people in your community pushing back against it the whole time. And when you did free your slaves, you compensated them back pay.
Wow.
I mean, that's pretty amazing. So yeah, I agree with you. I think as a group, they do a good job.
Yeah. So yeah, then I'm interested, like, okay, what's the like Quaker theology, like this, what motivated Benjamin Lay to, I think he went around like wearing almost no clothes in like the middle of winter, and he would stand outside the Quaker meeting and they'd be like, what's the matter with you? What are you doing? He's like, this is what the African people have to deal with in these free United States. You just give these talks of while being basically naked in the cold or something like this. I forget, but and they were on the wrong side of the government over and over and over. Like the government persecuted them. I found out that I have a distant relative who was a Quaker living in Virginia, in the Virginia colonies, and he got ran out with the other Quakers because I think they were protesting slavery or something, or treatment of Native Americans. And so they had to like flee to Maryland, the southeast part of Maryland, kind of like a swampy area where nobody really wanted to live, from what I understand. But a bunch of Quakers moved there because they were going to get killed if they stayed in Virginia.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Native American relations with the Quakers before, I mean, for a while until other people started to come in, like they had really peaceful um, time with Native Americans, and you know, I've just been amazed because I don't hear anything of Quakers today. I associate them with abolition, but then it's like, well, they kind of died out like the Shakers, and But I was listening to a podcast called City of Refuge, which is just a like 10 episode series on this guy from France, this nonviolent guy from France, who ended up with his village, like saving a couple thousand Jews by hiding them. And he, at one point in the series, I think he's imprisoned or somebody from his community is imprisoned, and they run into like a Quaker smuggler who's associated with the Friends Association. And it's like, you had Quakers who, when the US is keeping Jews out and nobody supposedly knows about the Holocaust, the Quakers know what's going on and they're over there helping out. You're like, holy crap. Like, I mean, it's just amazing what they do.
I think there was some things that I found at the very end of my thesis research that I couldn't follow up on because I was like, I have to finish and submit this thing. But one of them was Ida B. Wells talking about Dwight Moody and how she's like, Dwight Moody is no Quaker. Like she says that like pretty, and her being like an advocate for African American people in the Reconstruction period, African American herself. Yeah, she's like, Dwight Moody never did anything to help us, but the Quakers did. And so she kind of like points out this like two versions of Christianity that's, I think that I would say like African people tend to be like aware of it, African Americans especially, like Frederick Douglass, like Ida B. Wells, because they were the ones who were getting the short end of the stick from the Christendom people. So while the language was enough for some people, like many white people, it wasn't enough for African American people in the 1800s. So they were able to point out slave only Christianity is not Christianity.
Yeah, well, and that's because the Christianity, that slaveholding Christianity preserved, was really would have been really comfortable for somebody like me, and so of course it seems good because I'm not on the receiving end of that stick.
Yeah, and then I think about Jesus' statement again. I came to bring good news to the poor. Who was the poor at that time period? It was African Americans. It was Native Americans. Were they bringing good news to those people? No, they were bringing bad news. George Whitefield brought bad news to African American people. Like, sorry, no liberation for you. So then that kind of disqualifies his gospel for me. I mean,
well, and yeah, that's where Kierkegaard again is helpful for me, or where I have hope in looking at people like Kierkegaard who are true prophets. And that's because when you look at all this bad fruit, which seems like a pretty long series of bad fruit and unredeemed bad fruit, it's not like people recognize their mistakes and repent and turn, which would be one thing. But it's, I mean, even still today, with the far right just refusing to turn. But with Kierkegaard, so the question that I end up having is, okay, well, something's bad here. Is it Christianity? Is it the gospel? And I think I don't think that is, because I think Jesus is so right and so beautiful and so amazing. So Kierkegaard highlights the thing that I think it is, which is Christendom. And I don't want to throw out Christianity. I don't want to throw out Jesus, but I sure do want to throw out Christendom.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and I think no one since Kierkegaard, at least in like the academic philosophy, even though Kierkegaard was not an academic philosopher, few were in the 19th century. I guess there hasn't been someone respected in the way that he's respected by like secular people, I suppose. Since him, I mean, maybe you could go to like Alvin Plantinga. I just think that there's like kind of a time period. Feuerbach said the same thing also. He's like, Christianity has long since vanished from the earth. There's, whatever is going around calling itself Christianity is not Christianity. And so I think Kierkegaard, it's almost like him saying Christianity no longer exists is a lot like Nietzsche saying God is dead. Nietzsche also said, only where there are tombs can there be resurrection. So I kind of think that he's like allowing the possibility that like God could resurrect. But the Christianity that's being preached around him, he's like, this is not it. There is a quote even of him. I had it. I just sent it to somebody, so I wonder if it's here. But he talks about like that Christianity has so turned from its origin, and that it's sanctifying all the things that Christ advocated, or it's sanctifying all the things that the bringer of glad tidings held beneath him, like empire, like power and exploitation. He says all of this is a fist in the eye. Oh, and what an eye of the gospel. That's Nietzsche talking. And I was just shocked. That's in the Antichrist, even like the book, The Antichrist.
And is he speaking as himself there? Or is he speaking from like another perspective?
He's speaking as himself. This Nietzsche thing. I'm trying to find
I'm thinking of like thus spoke Zarathustra. He's not speaking from himself. He's kind of various characters are speaking.
Yeah. So the quote is that mankind should fall on its knees before the opposite of what was the origin, the meaning, the right of the gospel. That it should have sanctified in the concept church precisely what the bringer of glad tidings regarded as beneath him, behind him. It is a fist in the eye. Oh, and what an eye of the gospel. Friedrich Nietzsche, the end of his life. That's like one of the last things he wrote.
So do you think people just, because I'm like a novice when it comes to philosophy, so it's really easy to read the most popular things or to take quotes and to kind of form your ideas about an individual's thoughts. For me, I really didn't like Nietzsche because it seemed like he was against altruism. It seemed like thinking about other people was weakness. And he, the power was something that he elevated. And that didn't seem like a good thing. I understand why he says God is dead. I get that, and I don't fault him for that. But the moral ethic that I perceive from Nietzsche just doesn't resonate at all with me. So do you think that's a mischaracterization that a lot of people have of him, and maybe there were more Christian elements underneath, or how do you explain that?
Yeah, there's so Nietzsche's sister was a Nazi, and Nietzsche went crazy in 1890. So he wrote The Antichrist in 1889, and he lived 10 years of like basically not talking to people, and his brain just didn't work anymore. So from 1890 to 1900, when he died, he was like in a vegetative state basically, and his sister kept him alive. His sister pulled a whole bunch of his writings together and put them into a book called The Will to Power, and gave that to Adolf Hitler. And Hitler loved The Will to Power, which is kind of like a Machiavellian. Well, I don't know that he loved it. I don't think it was like the most important thing, but he like endorsed it and said, this is a good text. It was, I mean, I feel like it wouldn't be so different from like the self-help in general of today, which I also think of Abraham and Nietzsche in similar capacities, like the biblical Abraham, in that Abraham left the God of his fathers to advocate something new. And that was definitely what Nietzsche was about. He was about leaving the Christianity that he came from and looking for this Übermensch, right? This person. And often he would say, like, Christ is the closest thing to an Übermensch that we have, but his tradition was co-opted. So he wasn't powerful enough. So then he advocates, for these kind of powerful things. And he has not great things to say about women, not great things to say about Jewish people. So I think that especially if you're like aware of that kind of stuff, but the reception of Nietzsche as through the will to power is kind of a creation of his Nazi sister. It's like an editing of his Nazi sister, which, I mean, I don't know that the preface to that book like acknowledges that kind of thing, or if it's just printed. I assume the newer copies are like acknowledged that way. There's a guy named Walter Kaufman from Princeton University, who kind of after World War II, he put Nietzsche in a different perspective, but not everybody, is aware that their perspective comes more from Nietzsche's sister than from Walter Kaufman. Paul Tillich was really influenced by Nietzsche, but I also think Nietzsche, he didn't get there. Like, he wanted something new, he didn't get there. So then you have to look at the people around who, like Tillich, who read Nietzsche as a destroyer of Christianity, of Christendom, but then he's like, okay, we need to keep going because we can't just be will to power individuals. And I don't think Nietzsche, the Antichrist, was supposed to be the second book in a 7-volume series, but that was the last thing he wrote because he went crazy not long after that. So
yeah, I'll have to rethink about that, even if I end up disagreeing with a lot of what Nietzsche, his moral ethic and stuff, or what he thinks about Jesus. If he's like Kierkegaard at all in terms of what he destroys, I can respect that.
Yeah, and I would say, like, go with what you like more, which is probably the Kierkegaard thing. Like, I would probably advocate attack upon Christendom rather than the Antichrist, but I would say, like, hey, kind of similar, just like Nietzsche doesn't want to use the Christian language, Kierkegaard does want to use the Christian language to rebuild something. But it's not. And like, atheists hate my view of Nietzsche as well. He was a big reader of Ralph Waldo Emerson, though, and so Emerson is kind of like Kierkegaard in that he doesn't abandon theology, I guess. Emerson sort of abandons Christianity, sort of, but not theology. He becomes kind of more of a Spinozist. He always appreciates Christ, of course, but Emerson's like a Nietzsche that's like a less militant Nietzsche, less obviously militant anyway. I think the people at the Harvard Divinity School definitely perceived Emerson as very militant. They banned him from campus for 30 years. So they perceived him as militant.
So I want to, we're approaching modernity here to where we are today. And there's one other person that I want to touch on that I think you have some insight into that maybe helps us to understand Christendom and modernity and evangelicals, and that would be Ronald Reagan. Because I know you've had some experiences in South and Central America, and especially talking about liberation theology and some of what was going on down there, and assassinations and U.S. involvement and all that stuff. Wherever you want to take that and wherever you want to start, I'd love for you to maybe talk about that.
Yeah, I think probably the first like spark for me in that context was I went down to Nicaragua. I had a friend who bought a little piece of land there, very cheap, right on the beach, and we built a little house. And so I spent a month working on this little house, and then the second month I kind of just toured around, and I went to a place called Esteli in the north of Nicaragua, the mountains. And weirdly, everywhere I kept seeing these signs that that there were political signs, and it just said Christian, in Spanish. So it was like Cristiana, I think, and then Socialista, Solidaria, like single words: Christian, Socialist, Solidarity, like political people. And I'm like, timeout. You cannot be a Christian and a socialist at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. But I'm like, there it is right there. And I was just weirded out, like my brain, my history, my awareness, my inheritance, intellectual inherited awareness says this can't be. And so I went and stayed with these people in the mountains of Nicaragua, just the kindest people. Had just randomly met a Jewish guy, like kind of secular Jewish. I don't know that he was like really practicing, but he's from Israel, and another woman from the Netherlands. So the three of us were kind of like decided to do some of the tour things together. And we showed up to these people's house, and they had like it was just like the Shire. It was beautiful. Oh, my headphones are gonna die. So we'll change to a different sound. Maybe I'll just can you hear me?
Yeah, it works great.
Okay. So staying in this like place like the Shire, and they ask, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, I'm from California. I'm from the US. And they're like, oh, like so many people would be like, they would say, oh, we know that things have changed since Ronald Reagan. Like, so we're happy that you're here, And I was kind of like, what? We know that, the US is not everybody is like Ronald Reagan in the US. So we're happy that you're here. And I was kind of like, where did this come from? Like, what the heck? And so I got to talking to them and realized that these people in the mountains were like literally Christian socialists. And they talked about both aspects of that perspective for them. And he's like, yeah, we're socialists. Like I run the co-op here. The farms, we take our food to the co-op, and it gets distributed amongst the community. And, so obviously, I'm a socialist. So he's like, and that's why, like, Ronald Reagan was paying the Contras to come in here and terrorize us for the whole decade of the 80s. And I was like, what? I never heard that. And then they were so fascinated by my companion, the Jewish guy that I was with. They're like, oh my goodness, you're from Israel, the land of the Bible? They're like, tell us everything about this. So like for like 3 nights, every dinner, they were so thrilled to hear about the land of the Bible from this guy. And he would just talk about, like this area, Galilee region, and like down in Jerusalem. And this is where like Isaiah would have lived. And this is where like Amos was. And, the Torah, this and the Torah, that. And they were enthralled by this guy. So it was like very clear to me that their Christianity was not manufactured. And then their like socialism, it was really for them, it was all about cooperative living. And they lived in this mountainous region. And their place was not like a poverty kind of situation like Mexico or something that I've been in before. It was, though they only had a limited amount of electricity, but it was very well taken care of. And they were like, oh yeah, like all my children are they have PhDs in like agriculture, and they live like in Costa Rica or other parts of Nicaragua. And he's like, but yeah, of course, like, Ronald Reagan was after me in the 80s. Not like, there was no personal thing, but he's like, we had to live in the forest. And then he showed me, he's like, yeah, I was shot here in the arm by one of the Contras. And we basically lived in the forest. We would come back here for time periods, but we never knew when the Contras were going to come and attack us. Basically, right-wing fascists from Honduras were paid by the Reagan administration and the Carter administration. And before that, because the US was on the wrong side of this thing. They liked the dictator Somoza, and the socialists, basically Christian socialists, liberation theologians, advocated against the fascist dictators like Somoza throughout all of Latin America. But yeah, like the big story is like this Catholic priest named Oscar Romero. He's probably like the most famous of the liberation theologians in this context anyways. And he was in El Salvador advocating against the US supported fascism. And the US liked it because it was kind of like Saudi Arabia. Like, we picked a few families to make very wealthy, and then they would provide us with resources cheap and in the way we wanted it. So in Latin America, it was like a lot of fruit. It was a lot of beef. It was just really cheap for us. But we made a few people very wealthy, like the Somozas. And the Somozas kept Nicaragua in this, like, basically lord and serf arrangement. But we liked that because it was really cheap for us. And the liberation theologians started to see that, and they were like, this is really problematic, the way that people are being treated by the Somozas. And so we're actually going to advocate for the people against the Somozas. And the US didn't like that. So there were many different groups of people, like this particular one is called the Atlacatl Battalion. And they went to North Carolina to get trained. The first thing that they did when they got back from North Carolina is they went to Oscar Romero's church and shot and killed him.
So it's not like, you know, the U.S. are necessarily, I mean, we don't know, but the U.S. isn't necessarily saying, okay, hey, send us a hit squad, we'll train them. But we know the types of people that they're sending us, and we know what they're going to do with what we train them to do. Yeah.
And I read into it more because obviously I'm like, wow, Reagan is like the best president of the 20th century as far as like the people I know are concerned. And so I was very confused to find out about this, and then to find out that basically the way we think of Hitler is the way they think of Reagan because of what he did in Latin America. And I was like, this was again like, well, I thought I was, you know, I thought I was like small government, or I thought I was a Christian, but I thought Reagan was a Christian. I thought like, but then come to find out that like what he did in Latin America in particular was really horrific. And he did it even totally illegally. Like, I think that it was something with the money, like he couldn't.
The Iran Contra.
Yeah, Iran Contra. So Iran, he sold weapons to Iran, and then the money went directly to the Contras, which was in Honduras, to fund terrorizing the Nicaraguans.
Yeah, and this also gets into you know, there's the conspiracy that involved the CIA allowing crack to continue so that they could get money to funnel to the Contras because they couldn't obtain that money through the government anymore. And so the crack epidemic was at least in part a result of CIA maybe not conspiring with drug dealers, but at least looking the other way.
Mm-hmm. And like I first heard Noam Chomsky talk about it concisely, and he just said liberation theology was an attempt to bring the Gospels back into Christianity. So like, you know, we might say that it's a Kierkegaardian thing, again, like trying to reintroduce Christianity to Christendom. That's what liberation theology was. But he's like, but you can't have that. Christianity, as it has been known in the West, is the theology of the wealthy. It was the theology of Ronald Reagan, the theology of Cyrus McCormick and Donald Trump. It's not the theology of the poor. Like, you can't like advocate for the slaves. You can't advocate for the people being enslaved in Nicaragua in the 80s. So he's like, so of course we crushed it. Like, we violently repressed it. And you know, this was just wild because I was thinking, oh my gosh, the government is suppressing Christianity, but I have been following Christendom. I've not been following Christianity. Yeah, so I'm getting it. Yeah, I'm getting it from Christendom. I'm not getting it from Christianity.
Well, yeah, it's like our government. A lot of evangelicals have this martyrdom complex, this persecution complex. And it's like when you study history, you learn that, well, it's your government, like our government, that has actually been persecuting Christians just out there to secure my Christendom, like my version of Christianity and my comfort.
Mm-hmm. But also, like, we're worried about people, like the government coming into my home and shooting me or something, like what the government's going to come in here and take my kids from me. Guess what's been happening to Black people for like forever? Like Breonna Taylor was just like a few years ago. The government, a police officer came in there and shot her, killed her, and then said, "Oh, sorry, like wrong apartment," So like, and like, or Philando Castile, like the government, he said, "I have a gun in my in my glove box," and then the guy pulled out and killed Philando Castile for no reason other than the police officer was scared or something. But this is so like the government is coming and killing people. It's just not coming and killing white people. Or what's Dylan Roof went to African Methodist Episcopal Church in North Carolina, I think. Dylan Roof, he shot up a prayer meeting, but we don't think of that as like Christian persecution. But like how come I didn't hear about that Christian persecution? A guy came in and shot up a church, but it's not a big deal. Or like in the 1960s, the Birmingham, I think it was Birmingham Baptist. It was American Baptist. It was Black people. And white Christians went and blew up a church, killing 4 little girls. Was it Birmingham? Like Montgomery? I forget. I think it was Birmingham.
I think, yeah, I don't remember exactly.
During Sunday school, they killed 4 little girls. And that's not considered like Christian persecution? How come I never heard about that in Voice of the Martyrs,
Yeah, it reminds me of James Cone's Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is a really profound book, but I think that hits at exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. So all the things that I was like concerned the government might come and do, they've been doing for the history of the United States.
Well, and that's internally, but the people that you were talking to in Nicaragua, your government was going and doing that overseas, or at least supporting that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, we did do like a direct intervention in Chile, I think, where there was a democratically elected socialist leader, and we went in and took him out. It was Salvador Allende?
Yeah, and then Pinochet.
Yeah, we installed the right-wing person. What was it? Augusto Pinochet, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, Nicaragua was also, they were invaded in like 1910 or something, I believe. So there was U.S. domination. I think we were in country for like 20 years. Same time we were in country with Haiti. Yeah, we were in Haiti from like 1915 to 1934 or something. So we're in all of these countries, and yeah.
Yeah, and it's when you read into it, it's indefensible. And it was largely the Christians, the quote unquote Christians, the Ronald Reagans. I mean, but also Ronald Reagan, he was never, I don't know, was he actually a Christian? I think that like now that I've read about him, I don't know that he was a movie star.
Yeah, I think he catered to Christians and, used the right lingo and stuff.
He started his campaign at a place. It was this really random place in the South.
Philadelphia?
No, it wasn't Philadelphia. I'm trying to think, but it was a place where this community like lynched people, and then the federal government came in and said, "We're gonna prosecute this," because the local police wouldn't do it, and then that was a big like states' rights thing. Because they're like, no, you can't. The federal government can't come in here and like tell us what to do. And so the states' rights. So then Ronald Reagan started this. I want to say, and it might have been like at one of his campaigns or something. But I was like, the overt racism of this. Reagan states' rights. Oh, speech.
Yeah, I'm pulling up Neshoba County.
Yeah, Neshoba County. It is so weird to choose Neshoba County, but it was It was the site of the 1964 murders of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, which was like an unprosecuted racial thing. And so Reagan went there to say, like, I'm an advocate of states' rights. And it's like, it's just pure racism, and like of the worst kind. And it's not even, it's like a place that you wouldn't go. It's a small town. It's not like, it would make sense to me if it was like Los Angeles or something like that, or like a big city where there's a lot of support. But it was to signal to the racists of the South, especially because I think they knew what Neshoba County was about. But other people, but we chose not to. And I think about that a lot with regards to the dominant Christianity in the United States, that it chooses ignorance very often. Like that's what the plain reading of scripture of Dwight Moody was about. He didn't want the social, historical, or literary perspective. He wanted his own interpretation, which is so wild because we heard it all the time that like this is objective, and liberals are just, the Bible can mean whatever they want it to mean. And I'm like, now that I've looked through history, I'm like, we are describing ourselves. We are the ones who read this and made it into whatever we wanted it to be. Yeah, we are the ones in cancel culture.
I think that's a good observation that we so often describe ourselves. It clicked for me there where you say that things are objective, and then you realize, well, yeah, your interpretation is supposedly objective. Or for me, in regard to the big one for me was in the 2016 election, I had been on a high horse against moral relativism. Like, moral relativism just doesn't make any sense. And then 2016 happens, and I'm like, oh my gosh, all of you are moral relativists.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I was looking for it out there, and I was blindsided by it in my own community. But cancel culture. You look at all of the things that we are that evangelicals are canceling. It's insane. And we've done that forever. Being cancel culture, we describe ourselves and we just don't see it. Like I think you said, we choose ignorance. I wouldn't say that we don't see it. I think we choose it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like there are prophets amongst us, like a Martin Luther King. I think he was saying some very relevant things about race, and then he was saying some very relevant things about poverty and things about the Vietnam War, and people did not want to hear it because it's so, like Daniel Berrigan, a radical Catholic priest said, he said, the poor tell us who we are. Like the Nicaraguan people, they tell us who we are. The African-American slave tells us who we are. And the prophets tell us who we can be, like a Frederick Douglass, like a Kierkegaard, they tell us who we can be. So we hide the poor and we kill the prophets. Over and over again. We do this over and over again. Which is hard for me now. This is like where I'm personally at. I think about all the time. That's how do I advocate this path that everybody wants to hide, that everybody wants to kill? Like, people do not, how do you advocate for people who don't have healthcare, or people who grew up in a place where they weren't able to like be a part of society, really? They didn't get the education they needed to have a good job, are not networked well enough to have a good job, grew up. How do you advocate for that? Because I think it kind of is, it's a failing project in a way. Cornel West often says, studying philosophy is really about learning how to die daily, which is also like a Christian thing. I think, Jesus talks about taking up your cross and dying. or Romans 12 being a living sacrifice, a thing that dies over and over. Is that what these, I mean, and I kind of think it's about like learning that we're going to fail over and over and over before we succeed. There were a lot of proto Martin Luther Kings, and Martin Luther King himself was killed. I think Kierkegaard is one of these proto people, and he lived a life that was not glamorous. It looked, I mean, nobody read his stuff. He didn't have like, he was rediscovered later. You know, he died in obscurity. But that's hard, and it's hard to like also be like chipper and happy and optimist and like, hey, want to, you know, be a part of this like justice movement. But it's also Paul. Paul, you know, I heard this funny thing about Saint Paul, who Paul of the New Testament, that he's like, yeah, I had a successful career. You know, I was involved in like the higher levels of Jewish thought, and then I met this guy Jesus on the road one day. I went blind for 3 days, and then you know, I was about to go kill Christians, but then I decided to be one of them, and so now I've been subjected to the lash. You know, the 40 lashes minus one. I got shipwrecked. People want me dead. I don't have, you know, money anymore. And you too can have this same Jesus. If you want, like, it's not a glamorous thing. It's not, Jesus is not speaking from glory. Like Kierkegaard said, he's not part of the big wealthy church saying, come and follow me. He's basically the, you know, the homeless ex-carpenter, washed up rabbi saying, come and follow me. I don't have a place, you know, this foxes have holes and birds have their nests, but this Son of Man has no place to lay his head. That's a Jesus thing, you know. And so it just makes it hard, you know. So that's the question I'm asking right now, is like, how do you actually advocate this thing that people don't want? And Christian people, maybe even the most, don't want. They want the Christendom. They don't want the Christ.
Yeah, I think that's where, you know, Kierkegaard, whatever his ideal was, he had something that he latched onto that was able to drive him. And for me, that's, I mean, yeah, Jesus, but I'm trying to think something more tangible that people who aren't Christians might understand. I guess for me, when I see where this other morality leads, like where consequentialism leads, I mean, this is why I wanted to do this season on propaganda and conspiracy, because I recognized that I was propagandized and everybody around me was propagandized in my evangelical circles. I'm still propagandized. Just hopefully I'm becoming more aware of it and able to fight it a little bit better. But when you start just digging in historically, like far back, but also even, you don't even need to go far back. You can just go, like you said, back to Ronald Reagan. You can go back 5 years, and just recognizing all of the death and destruction and injustice and oppression that consequentialism and other moral ethics lead to for other people, even if not yourself, is just horrendous. And I think you need that historical look, because, like you said, okay, Kierkegaard died in obscurity. He could have come to the end of his life and said, everything I did was worthless, right? By consequentialist standards, he's a loser. He misses out. I think your Nietzsche quote about, you know, where there are tombs, there are resurrections. I think that's what a dying to self I kind of view as doing, where it's, maybe I die in obscurity, but if what I have to say is good and valuable and God can use that, then he will use that. My job is to hold on to the ideal and pursue that, and let God take control of that. Because you look at consequentialists like, you know, Whitefield. Okay, we've got evangelicals who are still upholding him, but now we've got a lot of people who are saying, no, down with Whitefield. Like, we've got plenty of other good people that we can go to, but his legacy isn't going to last because of the moral compromises that he made. Whereas somebody like Kierkegaard, who dies in obscurity, is going to be remembered. And I don't know if that makes sense.
I was going to say, we don't remember the Roman Empire. We remember Jesus. Jesus' story is much better than the Roman Empire story. And it's the tradition that I want to be a part of. I think of that song all the time. When the saints go marching in, oh Lord, I want to be in the number when the saints go marching in. So I do want to be on that right side of history. I do want to be part of the prophetic tradition, but it's hard, and yeah, it's just hard, but that's also why the prophets like Elijah, after his big moment against the prophets of Baal, he's like super depressed and wants to die, like he won, but kind of like at what cost? Like social isolation. And
yeah, because that's when he goes and hides in the rock, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I only found that out a couple of years ago. I was like, wait, this is after that? And it blew my mind because, yeah, he should have been coming into glory at that point.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, he wasn't. And then that's when, like, the tornado came, but God was not in the tornado. This came, but God was not in that. And then like a still small voice spoke to him, and God was in that like still small voice. And I think it told him to take a nap or something like that, doesn't it? Like, just have some food and like rest. It's cool. Which is a message, I think for a lot of us, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. Maybe that too.
I got, I guess, one more question here for you, and then you can kind of round things out as you want to. I guess that would be, all right, we've gone all the way up to Ronald Reagan, and liberation theology and all that stuff. But it's been 40 years plus since Reagan. And we're at an interesting place in the United States in regard to evangelical Christianity, Christendom. Yeah, it looks like lots of things are happening on the world stage. It looks like the U.S. is not doing so hot, and it looks like, I guess, I don't know what's going on in the States, but it seems like conservative Christians are going to back Trump again. Is that correct?
I haven't been paying that much attention, but I think so, yeah.
All right. So talk about the modern state of Christendom and any closing thoughts you might have.
Well, like you, I think the first time I was able to vote was for Bush Jr., and I did vote for Bush Jr. I was, actually, I think I was like a week too young to vote for him in 2004. But actually, no, I voted for Ron Paul, actually. So, in 2008, I think that was my first vote. I voted for Ron Paul, I think. But Bush, I mean, we think about what he did in Iraq, and then what Obama did in bailing out the banks in the 2008 crisis, which was, I mean, I don't know how we can call Obama anything near the left, because he did that right-wing move. But to me, it's like we could have invested in affordable housing rather than the Iraq war, but we spent trillions on the Iraq war. And again, instead of bailing out the banks, we could have invested again. I mean, I think housing is like probably one of the most important things. We could have invested in infrastructure, but we didn't. We decided to give the money straight to the banks, and they do whatever the heck they want with it. And I think in many ways that kind of screwed up our generation. And Bush was certainly the choice of evangelicals. I don't think there was nobody in my circles that was advocating anything but Bush. And then, yeah, I mean, 81% voting for Trump, and continuing the the anti-Christian things of Reagan. And so I don't know, like I don't have very much, but I also think that there was a big shift with our generation. I think many of us came of age, in that 2010, 2011, 2012. And I think we started to see that there is a very problematic nature to the ignorance of evangelicalism of our parents' generation. So we are making it better. But the thing is that like slaveholding is profitable, and Reagan's actions were very profitable. So of course people love them. Profitable for a certain group of people, and they're taking that wealth and they're building castles, fortresses and things. But they're blowing up Iraq, they're blowing up places all over the world. Anything that contests them, they're just blowing it up. So it's just a bummer, because I think for our generation, it kind of sucks that that's the way that they're using their wealth, is to fortify against awareness, fortify against learning about their social sins. And they're spending it on more and more interesting ways to have fun, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, so it makes sense, Trump and stuff. I mean, Trump to me is very much like a Cyrus McCormick Jr. So like it makes sense that Franklin Graham is a lot like the Dwight Moody, and then Trump is a lot like the Cyrus McCormick Jr. So to me, it's the McCormick Moody gospel again. And it's a long tradition, and it is profitable for a certain group of people. I don't think it's good for the world, but it is profitable for them. And actually, Blaise Pascal, I think about this quote all the time. Unable to fortify justice, we justify force. Justice and force, justice and power. Unable to power justice, we justify power. Or we say profit. Unable to give money, to give profit to justice, we justify profit. And so I think we have a hard time understanding what is power and what is justice. And if power just uses the language of justice, or like says we give 1% to the planet, then we're like, cool, great, profit and justice. But it's not. George Whitefield, unable to build his orphanage in a just way, he decided to build his orphanage in an unjust way. And we say, hey, I'm supporting an orphanage, but you're doing it unjustly. And isn't justice actually just about like social sustainability even? Like I think the prophets are saying your profit-seeking motives are unsustainable. Like your kids are going to find out that you got your wealth by terrorizing Nicaraguans, and there is somehow a still small voice that we hear, like the rocks cry out. If no one will speak like Jesus, if no one will speak like the prophet, even the rocks will cry out. Like we will find out. The blood of Abel cries out from the ground. Remember that line? Like Cain kills Abel, and then God says, where is your brother Abel? And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? Like, I don't know where he is. Meanwhile, Cain killed him, of course. And then God says, the blood of your brother Abel cries out from the ground. And so I think right now it's the blood of the Native Americans is crying out from the ground. The blood of African Americans is crying out from the ground. The blood of women is crying out from the ground. The blood of just poor people in general is crying out from the ground. And our parents' generation and evangelicalism in general does not want to hear it.
Yeah, I think our generation, I think in our lifetime, it's going to come back on us. It just seems like things are kind of going that way. And I'm not into predicting eschatology or anything, but one of the things that I did think was interesting, and it clicked for me with the 1619 Project. I'm like, wait, that's 400 years, 2019. And, biblically speaking, that 400 years, Egypt, all that kind of stuff. I'm like, okay. And things go in 40s and, 40 times, or this times 10. So it's 400's a magic number in the Bible when a lot of things kind of come back on you. And I was like, well, that's about when things started to really take a turn in our society. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, for me, 2012 was the year that I was like, I can't really be a part of this anymore. And it was right about the same time, like the Mayan calendar said the world was going to end. And so it was, the world was, or, they stopped predicting, I don't know what it was, but it was like December 2012 is like when the Mayan calendar predicted like the end of the world. And now I see like the prophet, the eschatology thing, as not so much like the end of the world, but the end of kind of an age, or the end of an empire or something like that. And so for me, yeah, like a particular age or dominant system died in 2012. And I hope, something is being reborn. I think something is being reborn. Something is resurrecting. But it's a hard process. It's not like, the changing of things is not easy. So
I guess for you, and something for me to remember too, is that, assuming that we are, at least in some ways, trying to be true prophets and avoiding the false prophet route. It is encouraging when you look at the Bible that the or as Niebuhr said, the wilderness prophets, they do have a harder time, but they also tend to be smaller in number, and things don't seem to go too well for them. And so I think, Jesus promised that those who followed him would bear a cross. And I think that's generally indicative of going the right route. So hopefully we do find ourselves in that number, the number from your song, but also the number of the minority true prophets.
And there is something like kind of, I don't know, I like the integrity, feels good. Like I have made the hard decision, at least in this sense, I made, I think, the right decision, even though it's been sort of hard. And hard for me, like, it's not that, it's like, I live in San Diego, like the weather is perfect, I play soccer on Saturdays and surf on Sundays, I get to eat the best Mexican food in the world. Sorry, Mexico. I don't know. Yeah. So there's good stuff too. There's a lot of good stuff. And that's what I'm trying to remember.
All right. Well, I think that's all the line of questioning that I have for you, unless there's anything that you want to add that you forgot or think would be a good addition.
No, I think, yeah, I think we said a lot. We said a lot. We're about over 2.5 hours.
Yeah, almost 3. Yeah.
So, all
right,
it's good for me.
Yeah. Well, thanks for taking time out of your day to do that.
No problem. Thank you so much.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.